Humanism focuses on what is human rather than on what is divine, and invites us to think for ourselves. A humanist rejects anything that might be perceived as being self-limiting. A self-limiting identity is much like a single tree. If we are blinded by that single tree, we miss out on being the beneficiaries of an entire forest of human knowledge. An exclusively ethnic identity, for example, is by definition self-limiting. When a culture's insular narrative shackles the individual human spirit by requiring absolute obedience, it becomes a cult with rules and regulations and chastisement for those who fail to conform. Whereas today's Hungarian exile community prides itself on its insular culture, Hungary's most enlightened monarch, Matthias Corvinus, strove to open the Hungarian mind to the rebirth of knowledge known as the Renaissance. The humanist movement may have started in Italy, but its second stop was Hungary, as Italian scholars and the knowledge they brought with them quickly migrated to Hungary and the court of Matthias Corvinus, facilitated by virtue of the Hungarian king's marriage to the Italian Beatrice, and by the efforts of the greatest Hungarian humanist of all time, the poet Janus Pannonius. Inspired in part by Janus Pannonius, who had rediscovered the classics of antiquity, Zoltán Böszörményi, in his latest volume of poems, The Conscience of Trees, alludes time and again to the great thinkers and poets of ancient Greece and Rome. There are copious references to Socrates, Plato, Cicero, and Virgil, and other luminaries of the classical pantheon. Although humanism did not start until the 14th century with Francesco Petrarch, we may regard those philosophers and poets as humanists. Böszörményi expands his list to include humanists from the medieval, the modern, and the postmodern era, right up to the 21st century. He populates his inner life with classical thinkers who are his guides, just as Virgil was Dante's guide in the Divine Comedy. But the poet is more than a classicist, for he is at home with modernists like Ferlinghetti, Pynchon, Dylan Thomas, and Bob Dylan. A study in diversity, his eclectic library includes Kant, Whitman, Joyce, Kafka, Mann, Updike, Ginsberg, Ashbery, O'Hara, and many others. We are at once reminded of Yale critic Harold Bloom's celebrated list in The Weston Canon, The Books and School for the Ages. Böszörményi has his own canon of original minds that forged their own individual voices and had the courage to express themselves for no other reason than for the sake of their art. Humanist literature transcends collective identities such as ethnocentric or nationalist narratives, political ideologies and their revolutionary fervor, and the dogmatic orthodoxies of organized religion. In his latest collection of poems, Böszörményi's operative metaphor is a forest, and the numerous allusions a colonnade of trees. Each towering tree stands for a philosopher, historian, poet, or artist who has withstood the test of time and is now teaching us to think for ourselves. They are profound intellects whose creations are bound in books on ethics, aesthetics, poetics, virtue, truth, beauty, or works of art and science, and everything else that can teach us a higher truth about ourselves and the meaning of our lives by giving our lives meaning. This in itself is by no means a novel idea, but it is timely. Why? Because we live in an age that seems to be regressing to fundamentalist religion, xenophobia, homophobia, misogyny, racism, and identity isolationism, all of which are roadblocks to knowledge in a relentless pursuit to close the human mind. In a key poem, Forest and Field, Böszörményi is able to view a much larger picture than if he were bound to a single identity, no matter how existential it may seem to survival. Forest and Field is such an important poem that we could easily take it as the poet's humanist manifesto. From a bird's eye view, the forest readily lectures on subjects the field should understand, calls for free thinking and freedom, to exchange ideas, but simply to go on living. Its slogan, the diversity of the individual is power, light, and air. Although he listens to new songs, it enjoys the classics, the birthplace of music, Plato, Shakespeare, Erasmus, Lao Tzu, and the Orphic melodies. It keeps in touch with Faulkner, Updike, Pynchon, and adores Nietzsche, Rilke, and all the romantics. It shouldn't matter whether we approach reality from the forest or the field, so long as we follow nature's path to our given soul. The poem's didactic tone is appropriate here because the trees are not mere sentinels but mentors. As symbols of unity, stability, serenity, and wisdom, trees grow and mature according to their own natural laws and remind us of the uniqueness of our own organic evolution as individuals. A tree is not worried about its identity, about being Hungarian or European or global. Trees do not act as juries or judges. They do not pronounce sentences. In the poem, A Walk by the Arno River, Michelangelo is free to bestow a new sonnet to his love, Tommaso, without fearing reproach. In another poem about forbidden love, Love in Venice, Thomas Mann expresses his unfulfilled desire as a longing for beauty that is too exquisite to be accessible even in art. In Only Heads and Feet and Heads, a menage a trois is transfigured from a breathless catch-as-catch-can into performance art. The conceit, an allusion to Whitman's buzzed whispers, love root, silk thread, crotch, and vine, finds a catching echo in Böszörményi's sensuous tactile imagery. Like Lombard silk, the skin tightens on the bars of ribs. To a wise oak in a forest of other wise oaks, such things are as natural as sprouting buds and flushing out leaves. In his title poem, The Conscience of Trees, Böszörményi appeal is to nature's abiding calm. You must appeal to the conscience of trees. Their calm is the sign of confidence that you've coveted for ages. Even with a budding mind, their calm is doubt, the probability of the probable, the omnivorous self of the world with messy hair, now turning silver. Trees do not fear failure, rebellion, the cinder of time sifting into nothingness. The philosopher in Böszörményi is a seeker and lover of a wisdom that Promethean in its refusal to be bound by one identity to the exclusion of others. For James Joyce, one of the most admired novelists of our modern era, there was to be no compromise. In his portrait of the artist as a young man, he makes it abundantly clear that he intends to soar above the nets of nationality, language, and religion. Joyce ended up shedding his Irish identity, the Dantonesque Catholicism, and the obscure Gaelic tongue, but what he gained was his humanity and freedom of expression in a world language. Does that mean he had become a globalist? As it happens, Catholicism is very much a global enterprise, with the very word Catholic meaning universal. But for Joyce, Catholicism's unforgiving dogmatism had a strange hold on his freedom to create. I personally find such rubber-stamping labels as global or tribal as convenient ways to avoid having to think. Naturally, Böszörményi is free to think, to identify with whatever he wants and whenever he chooses. Poets often identify with their subjects, and these can be just about anything. The English Romantic poet John Keats, for example, identified so fully with the nightingale in his famous Ode to a Nightingale that he became the nightingale as he could sing with full-throated ease. In short, the poetic imagination will not be harnessed to a fixed identity. Byron put it this way: "What am I? Nothing. But not so art thou, soul of my thought, with whom I traverse earth." A poet then becomes what he imagines, and what he imagines serves him well as his makeshift persona, so that he may be an authentic portion of the universe. I live not in myself, but I become portion of that around me, and to me high mountains are a feeling, but the hum of human cities' torture. Böszörményi himself becomes a tree in his forest of trees. In that rarefied community, the poet can be unmistakably Hungarian and unmistakably Canadian, Barbadian, or Transylvanian, as long as the body of his verse is movingly human. Indeed, the forest in the conscience of trees is a great deal more suggestive of a humanist library than anything we might recognize as indigenous to a Transylvanian landscape, its mountain crags and pine-scented forests. But Böszörményi is a cerebral poet, not an imagist. He does not deal with the history of Transylvania, save for the poem about the martyrs of Arad. But he does deal with the history of ideas. Humanism is one such idea. His affinity toward his fellow humanist poet, Janus Pannonius, is unambiguous. They both come from mixed parentage, study abroad, revere the classics, espouse learning and the cross-fertilization of cultures, and they both seek emancipation from all manner of dogmatism. Janus Pannonius had this to say about blind religious obedience: "Poet and believer abide not together." A rather odd thing to say for a Catholic cleric and Bishop of Pécs. Some scholars dispute the context in which the statement was made and dismiss its significance as something that was said in jest. That being said, we are still left doubting the prelate's piety or his humanism, and while Böszörményi's penultimate poem, 5-star poem deluxe, pays tribute to one János Csezmete, the birth name of Janus Pannonius, we are abandoned to the same bewildering doubt. The tree of humanism has grown tall in the Hungarian land of Hunia, and so has Hungarian poetry. Sitting here we remain, although badly beat up. We have God light up our name. As he honors his famous precursor and his homeland of Hunia, something curious happens. Böszörményi, the self-proclaimed Calvinist atheist, unexpectedly acknowledges God. I should add here that I'm still trying to decipher the meaning of that hyphenated identity. But if we take a closer look at God's personification, the deity acts not so much as a supreme being as an agent that either co-creates with the poets or illuminates them. Thus, Böszörményi leaves us wondering about his Calvinism and his humanism unless, and this is paramount, unless we acknowledge that within the historical movement we call humanism, there is room for God beyond mere accommodation. Starting with the medieval monks, who were the first to revolutionize our attitudes toward our classical heritage, our first humanists transformed it to fortify their own Christian views. So, it is possible for a Calvinist to be a humanist, free to doubt, free to believe, or free to choose neither. Secular humanism and its insistence on atheism came later with the advent of science and philosophers like Nietzsche, Hume, and Heidegger. Today, it has morphed into an international society of free thinkers, who include agnostics, atheists, and rationalists. Böszörményi seems to vacillate between being a freethinker and a Christian humanist. In a poem, God Never Wrote to a Mortal as Touchingly, he writes, "But I was not asked to account for my faith, and what for? Those who believe will end up crucified." His wavering attitude toward God and religious orthodoxy is shared by another Hungarian, the great revolutionary Attila József, whose poem, With All My Heart, got him expelled from the university for its unabashed atheism. József, much more defiant of the status quo and its social injustices, totally immersed himself in fomenting a revolution. Böszörményi's intention is to move beyond the revolutionary fervor of József and other left-leaning 20th century Hungarian poets. In his The Poem Didn't Join the Class Struggle, he takes on not only Attila József, but another titan, Andrei Udi. Böszörményi recognizes the limitations of a voice manacled in the service of a revolution for a socialist utopia. The poem starts with a subtle yet dismissive reference to Andrei Udi in Paris. The poem dropped out, didn't join the class struggle, toured Paris and saw Andrei Udi, and went to track down Pushkin in Moscow, driven by an urge to juggle the view of his untamed face in search of liberty and love until daylight turned black above. Without leveling any criticism on Paul Sohar's excellent translation, I should like to point out that the original Hungarian refers to Andrei Udi as Bundi, which in English would be Andy. The familiar nickname suggests less an intimacy between two Székely poets than the intentional de-defying of a deity in the Hungarian poetic canon. In his treatment of Attila József, Böszörményi is less subtle, and his verse approaches the level of parody. And it is to the credit of Paul Sohar's artful rendition that the lines alluding to Attila József succeed in evoking József's inimitable style. "You cried out, 'Go join the class struggle. Together with the masses you'll rise.' Only in the meantime classes got fuzzy, and I'm nowhere in the era I wore off. I was stumbling in thickening fog. All my efforts were for nothing. Believe me, the word did not make an iron fist." The poet's repudiation of violence as a means to an end is absolute. József's call to arms does have a precursor, and a rather beloved poet at that, in the person of Sándor Petőfi, whose impassioned poem Rise, Magyars had become a rallying cry in the revolution of 1848. By contrast, the voice of the humanist is never shrill. True humanists are pacifists, whose attitude is one of universal tolerance and generosity. Such sentiment may be perceived as naive and idealistic, and to some of its harsher critics, the overblown pathos inclines towards the pathetic. The American poet Ezra Pound, who was not above using art for propaganda, once described humanism as an old bitch gone in the tooth. Böszörményi himself indicts Attila József for his obsessive daydreaming about a utopian future at the expense of simply being and living. When the dream ends, disillusionment sets in, followed by nihilism and despair, and in the case of the great socialist poet, suicide. Poem. Do you see the future? The creator is laid back in a bed of space. The dream is nil. The shallow night has bled into mist, It's flying in your face, with algae rocking in it as it wiggles to you on the smile of veins. Stitch yourself to ancient skies and cast your eyes at me. Although it jets, all accessories of desire go to waste and your muscles bind. I ask the fear that listens to its strings to come and stand with me on a cliff and make believe that you're again living off the power of today. It is up for debate whether Utilejojev and Andrei Udi are truly humanist poets. What is indisputable is that Zoltán, Böszörményi, Andrei Udi, and Utilejojev are Hungarian poets. Their Hungarianness is by virtue of the fact that all three wrote in their native vernacular. In times of political oppression or social upheaval, the Magyar language becomes a rallying cry for national identity. This should not surprise us. What is often overlooked is that a leftover strain of Renaissance humanism, which insisted on using Latin as the primary language, had competed with the rise of the vernacular in just about every European country, with the exception of Hungary, where Latin was still the official language. But this had less to do with the reassertion of Renaissance humanism than political expediency. Hungary's Habsburg rulers had denied Magyar as the country's official language, and, in point of fact, Magyar did not become the official language until much later, when it replaced Latin, first between 1844 and 1849, and then in 1867. This hardly suggests that Hungarians had spurned their mother tongue. On the contrary, Hungarian poetry thrived with or without the imprimatur of officialdom, proving again and again that a coerced identity, this time by way of language, will always be challenged by the creative spirit. Eschewing dogma or propaganda, poets found ingenious ways to express their individual voices in their mother tongue, enlivening and enriching the language. Today, Hungarian poetry in the Magyar vernacular is alive and well, and perhaps doing even better in regions where Hungarians are in the minority and their language under existential threat. And thanks to poets like Zoltán, Böszörményi, and his esteemed literary periodical, The Literary Present, imaginative literature of the highest quality continues to be firmly rooted in the Hungarian language. Poetry will continue to blossom, nurtured by a new generation of poets whose identities will be shaped by their own uniqueness and in a language that delights in hammering out new words and in bewitching chords, and sometimes to the amazement of the stars.